Very graciously, Dale has taken the acrylic cover off the front of this case that contains vintage paint so we can get a better look. The smell that is wafting out of this, the smell of the enamels, they're very distinct from the smell of the lacquers. It's just amazing. It really takes you back because if you remember, the lacquers had that great sweet smell, especially these AMT candies. Love that. This is part 4 in our 4-part series of the International Model Car Builders Museum. If you missed them, be sure to watch parts 1, 2, and 3 in the series.
We really start at the root of the hobby. This is some of the earliest available materials in the model car hobby. What was available to model builders back in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s and beyond.
Before we had all this nice filler material we have here, we had this thing called Duratite surface putty. At the same time, we had a material called plastic wood. It worked well on wood, but on plastic, it has a solvent in it which literally dissolves the plastic. It's hard. It gets really, really hard. So it doesn't work the same consistency of plastic. That's all we had. So that's what we used. You were very limited with what you had for cement. We had the tube glue, which early on worked really well. Then they put out a plastic glue for models that wouldn't even hold the model together.
In the 70s, when they came out with that citrus smelling glue, the advantage is now we can disassemble those kits much easier when we want to build them up.
All you do is just kind of move it and it comes apart.
Yeah. You've seen the museum, you've been to the show. What impressed you the most?
I would say, like, when I go into the museum, it gives you a new appreciation for, what did we have available to us in the 60s and the 70s. Things have progressed a lot with technology. So,
glue.
Come a long way. Glue.
We've got new glue.
No kidding.
When we all started this, we did with the brush paint. Then we progressed till we had the aerosol cans. And then when we got even better, we went and bought an airbrush. Get finite detail using an airbrush because you can control the flow of the paint. This particular one is made by Badger, and then you bought a can of propellant. This is the second generation of propellant, in that the first generation of propellant was basically a freon compound. This is now ozone-free, so that's a new one. So it was a whole nother level that it brought the modeling industry to. They're a great tool. Down below here we have a couple of compressors which are available for home use. They're very handy. It's another option if you want to spray paint.
When I see these custom spray lacquers, when I started spraying with those, it was like 60s going into the 70s, and it was just magic psychedelic paint. It was cool stuff, and it went on really well. I always felt like, wow, I'm a painter now.
And the lacquers were so nice because lacquer paint is very forgiving. If you get a sag or a run in it, you just let it dry, you sand it off and spray over it, and nobody knows it was there. Nobody knows that you really messed it up.
One of the biggest game changers when it comes to paint was the polishing kit. When that came out in mid to late 80s, people were using testers enamels. They were relatively soft paint. Those polishing kits like Millennium 2000 leveled the playing field. Because even if you were an average painter, you could polish your paint, and it was a super beautiful gloss.
The vacuum form machine?
The holy grail for so many people because...
Oh yes. These started out as a toy. Mattel put them out as a toy. Modelers found a use for them.
I would see ads on TV for these. I was like, wow, that'd be so cool to get that, because I could make a buck. I could make any kind of hood scoop I wanted. I just never got one back in the day.
There again, it opened up a whole new facet for modeling.
All the files.
Dental picks.
Everyone was asking their dentist,
oh yeah,
you have any extras? Of course, the razor saw. Another cool thing when I saw that in Car Model magazine.
Oh yeah.
I was like, oh, gotta start cutting things up.
Had to have one of them, yeah.
Interestingly, for all the razor saws I have, the one which I believe is X-Acto brand, like in the very beginning, or was given as a birthday gift, I still have, and it's still my favorite. It still does a great job.
You use the most.
It's still sharp.
As long as you use it on plastic, I don't think you'll ever wear it out.
But the kits were so finite in a way. My local hobby shops, they'd have walls of these parts packs. These are some of my favorite inspiration because I was just out there going, what could I do?
They allowed you to customize your own little product that you had made. You put different hubcaps on it. You put headers on the engine instead of using the exhaust manifolds. You could change the grill. There's so many things you could do. Put your own personal touch on it. And that's what made them sell well. Some of them are still available today.
I want to build a street rod. and plenty of street rod models, but maybe the engine or whatever you wanted wasn't there. You could pick up this Caddy engine. And I'm looking at the valve covers. Are they script? The Revell were great detail. All these guys. There was also this one for the Allison engine. This eventually got brought back in a Thunderbird kit, but originally it just came out like this. And this is a well-detailed engine. These Allisons were used in offshore powerboats. They were also used in a lot of drag cars. So you weren't able to get your Allison engine in your other kit, but you could pick up a parts pack and modify it. Then if you just want to do customs, you've got all these grills.
Complete set of the Revell custom car parts, all the different frame kits and bodies, wheels and tires, engines, everything again that was offered in that time period to allow you to make your scale model cars just that more unique.
I remember displays more like this going into the hobby shop and seeing this Bantam. You could build a drag car out of that, or the Topolino. You could build really cool gassers. Of course, there's a T-Bucket Roadster body. But somehow the fact that these were molded in a slightly darker than middle gray made them very serious. Like, to me, they were like this is like what grown-ups would use. As a little kid, this is like really serious, cool stuff. Well, yeah, and when I picked up Rod and Custom, or Hot Rod magazine, that's the kind of thing I'd see, these hot rod parts. So I was very inspired.
There's another parts pack down there with some interior. It's a very thin vinyl material, much like a Naga hide. The problem with it was, at the time, we didn't have any kind of adhesive that would bond it on.
A unique facet here is a complete set of upholstery kits that were available in the hobby that allowed you to install scale carpeting and upholstery and detailing for the interior of your cars.
You would see these in the Auto World catalog, but these were available in hobby shops.
By today's standards, these kits were pretty crude, but they were the best of any option that we had at the time. You see them now on models that were used on some of the old vintage models, and it's all coming loose and coming off. We didn't have adhesives like we have now. Our materials that we use today are just so much different and so much easier in many respects. And I think that's why, generally speaking, when you go to a model show now, the quality of model that you see is far, far better than anything we've ever seen before.
And we're still having fun.
Oh yes,
That's
the whole idea of it.
Another aspect of the hobby is represented in this cabinet, and that was the influence of full-size car customizers and designers on the hobby. Oftentimes, they would design a full-size custom car, show it at their shows, and very soon thereafter, a model manufacturing company would license that design and build model kits of that car. The top shelf here represents the work of Tom Daniels. His work was very creative. He did a lot of strictly show car type designs. Many of those turned into model kits, complements of a monogram. On the next shelf down is the work of Ed Roth. Ed was a very imaginative, very creative car customizer in the 60s. He was known for so many things. Probably the most famous thing he's known for is just the concept of Ratfink. That was his mascot, so to speak. It's a little rat character. He had that as his trademark, pretty much. This shows some of the influence he had on the hobby, the kits that were built, the line of paints that were designed by him and produced by the company under his name.
Bud Anderson worked for AMT, and he was called the Cat from AMT. They put together this nice memory of him, shows some of the real cars, the a la carte, the El Matador, the Astro, and he would build model cars on his table and then get AMT to make a kit of it. We've collected both empty kit boxes and mint condition kits. This is some of the early kits that came out. This is 1/32nd scale, which some people built because it didn't take up so much room. And there were several famous box artists. There's some guys that collect specific box art guys. One guy's named Linwood. Everybody loves his stuff. Well, this was aptly named Highway Pioneers because it was not only the pioneers of real cars, it was the pioneer of the model industry. These are some of the first model kits that came out, and so these are pretty collectible as well to get all the different ones that they had available. And then they came out later with some jalopies and things like that. And then when they found out how popular those were, it launched into the customizing kits and stuff because kids wanted to build hot rods more than they wanted to build brass era cars.
We have a rather extensive collection of production artifacts from the various major kit manufacturers in the United States. One of them essentially is from the Revell Corporation. In this particular case, we have the rarest of all pieces known in the hobby, and that's the stillborn 1957 project in which Revell made a proposal to General Motors to produce a quarter-scale Chevy 265 engine kit. General Motors shipped to Revell a full-scale iron 265 V8 from Detroit to California. Revell promptly took it to a machine shop and had the engine block sliced into 1-inch widths so that the model makers, the technicians, the people who made the molds could have direct access to what the parts really looked like without having to disassemble the block. That resulted in a complete engine kit in quarter scale of every part in plastic, from rod ends, pin ends from pistons, to valve stems, to valve seats, to valve covers, rocker arms, lifters. The whole thing was there. Literally, if those things had been metal, one could have assembled presumably a working quarter-scale Chevy 265 V8, which at that point was a very new engine. That's machined literally as a small block Chevy crankshaft. That's how expert they were with it. When the work was done, Revell made a proposal to General Motors. General Motors, after deliberation, turned the project down, paid the modest fees they had agreed to pay to Revell, and walked away from the project. Later, Revell and Monogram went back to 8 scale, but nothing in quarter scale was ever made. We have the only surviving parts here, the original presentation booklet with handwritten notes in it, along with the complete engine, parts of an engine, and the big presentation board which hangs on the far wall. Builders who have a long history in the hobby know of nothing that's more rare than this. All of this has occurred because it was intolerable that this part of Americana, these essential elements of what it was like to be a young person in the 60s, and more than just being a car enthusiast, but wanting to create miniatures, to create small versions of reality with increasing levels of skill and detail. It was unacceptable that we would think that all of this would just fade away. But with that, of course, came the inevitable reality that those of us who had started it weren't getting any younger. And we did not have the financial resources that it would take to create a permanent museum in Salt Lake City. So we started to reach out. I reached out to Clay Smith, the CEO of the Museum of American Speed, and I got in touch with Tim Matthews, curator of the Museum of American Speed. And we formed this relationship where we're going to be merging with them. That museum is well funded, run by a professional and large staff. So literally 50 years, 100 years, 200 years from now, people will be able to go in and appreciate what we have done. This will be part of Americana, part of the American automobile experience, shared by other countries, to be sure. I'm confident personally, after talking to the leading people at MAS, Museum for American Speed, that that's exactly what will happen.
What Mark was talking about was the Smith Museum, which is in Lincoln, Nebraska. If you have not seen that, you've not seen an auto museum. It is the largest Ford flathead collection in the world, of stock Ford flatheads, weird Ford flathead speed equipment. There are land speed cars in there. The Starboard collection is now there. There's a lunch pail collection there, I know. Mrs. Smith was a taxi collector. There is huge showcases full of all kinds of taxi stuff. People go to Lincoln, Nebraska just to go to the Smith Museum, but it's well worth it.
My name's Tim Matthews. I'm the curator at the Museum of American Speed in Lincoln, Nebraska. Our recent addition boosts the total square footage of the museum to 240,000 square feet, and it's 3 stories tall. Is just chock full of all things that celebrate American car culture. So you have hundreds of vehicles, even more engines. The museum really started out as a museum to celebrate internal combustion engines and the technology that drove America's racing cars, but it's evolved so much more since the early days. The collection started in 1952 with a couple named Bill and Joyce Smith. They were born in Lincoln, Nebraska, studied to become teachers, but they were involved in local racing. Bill began selling parts to the local racers, so he borrowed $400 to start Speedway Motors. He was also finding parts from days gone by that he was just really enamored by. Early speed equipment, and so in 1991 he started the Museum of American Speed. It's a 501c3 nonprofit educational museum, and it's just been growing ever since. And when they passed away, their 4 sons took over as the board of directors, and it became a celebration of all things American car culture. And so not only do we have cars and engines, but we have a fantastic art collection, we have toys, the biggest pedal car collection, the largest collection of lunch boxes, and the biggest tether car collection on public display anywhere in the United States, and just a fantastic array of custom cars. By the time you leave, it's an assault on your senses, really. And I've worked there for 10 years as the curator, and I learn something new in the museum every day. What I'm really proud of is it's really become America's greatest museum that celebrates American car culture, meaning all of American racing, production cars, custom cars, the freedom of self-expression that comes from building a car in your own garage. There's something for everybody in the museum. And by the time you walk away, you will have experienced something that touches you.
We've got two models there that were from 1950 or 51 that were carved from basswood by an F-86 pilot fighting in the Korean War. They were donated by his grandson 22 years ago. Tell me something more significant. That's the kind of thing we're after, to honor that guy, the Jim Keeler collection, the Augie Escanos. And that's the perspective that I would only agree to release if there were people who could actually carry that out. It's got to be a dedication and a commitment to the purposes of the museum, which is literally to preserve the history of our hobby from the point of view of the builder.
And I think the other thing that we do really well is we found that if you just have a line of really valuable cars parked, they don't mean anything to the viewer. You can go see a Delahaye or a Ferrari, but if you don't know the human story behind the car, nobody cares. So we really try to focus on the human story behind the objects, and that's really where the magic is. We're a very active museum. We're constantly changing the displays to keep it fresh. We have a lot of extremely wonderful events at the museum. We do a Cars and Coffee that draws an immense crowd the last Saturday of every month during the warm weather months, and so it's a place for people who love cars to gather. It really is about the ability to express yourself. So that's really what the museum's about. The model car element is something that we've been exploring for a long time. We have some spectacular models in the museum already, but we've always wanted to send this on a better path to supercharge that element of it, because model cars and model car building is so important to the overall spectrum of car culture in America that it really needs to be celebrated in a bigger way. And that's where this merger is so important and so exciting to all of us. So we're just excited to take the next step.
And we're so grateful to MAS and for all the people in the past, both named and unnamed, who have appeared on our list of supporters. And without the help of uncounted other people, this museum could simply not exist, and it must exist. And for that purpose, we're very happy to have this merger with MAS.
Restore, which is part of Habitat for Humanity, wants to take all the shelving, all the display cases.
Going to a good cause. Some of these in here, and walking through a flea market in Pennsylvania, and I just happened to see it, and I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting collection of old paint cans. And the fellow said, are you interested in that? And I said, well, no, not really. I said, I just thought it was kind of attractive. He said, well, for $5, you can have it all. And I think there was about 15 or 20 cans. Some were dry. But I thought, $5, you can't pass that up. Some of it's in here.
And it's so appreciated now.
It is. It's nice to know when you find things like that, that there is a place and would enjoy having it and can put it to use, and it preserves part of our heritage. And I think it's very important that we don't know where we're going if we don't know where we've been.
It has been an honor to tell the history of this amazing collection. We thank everyone who has shared their experience with us. And thank you to the many people that you did not see in this series, who built, maintained, promoted, and fundraised for the museum and helped it find a permanent home. Thank you to Mark for putting that very first artifact on a shelf in his garage, and to Tim for carrying it into the future.